law that bans sanctuary cities until Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett steps in. Ayotte claims it's about safety, but within minutes, Crockett drops undeniable evidence. Terrified children, silenced victims, and 135 sheriffs warning the law will backfire. The crowd freezes, the nation watches, and one question explodes across America. If helping a desperate mother becomes a crime, what's left of justice in this country? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. 1 week before the televised town hall, New Hampshire turned into the eye of a national storm. The marble steps of the State House in Concord were surrounded by reporters, floodlights, and a crowd split between applause and protest. At the center stood Governor Kelly Ayotte. Dressed in navy blue, her posture was stiff, her jaw set like stone. When she spoke, her voice was cold and deliberate, cutting through the noise like a blade. "We will not tolerate those who break federal law. There will be no sanctuary for them in New Hampshire. Not on my watch." Moments later, she signed two controversial laws, House Bill 511 and Senate Bill 62. One forced local police to comply with ICE detainer requests. The other allowed the state to sue any city that refused. Just like that, New Hampshire became the first state in New England to ban sanctuary cities outright. Conservative commentators erupted with praise. One Fox News anchor called Ayotte a model of modern leadership. Talk radio hosts compared her to Margaret Thatcher. But outside the Capitol, the mood was anything but victorious. Immigrant families in Manchester, Nashua, and beyond sat down to dinner in silence that night, afraid their fathers or mothers might not come home from work tomorrow. Civil rights organizations condemned the laws immediately. The ACLU called them weapons of fear disguised as law. Across social media and college campuses, the tension grew. In immigrant-owned grocery stores, small restaurants, and churches, conversations grew quieter, more anxious. Parents whispered about backup plans. Teenagers debated whether to walk to school alone. Then the silence cracked. On MSNBC's primetime segment, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was invited to speak. The Texas Democrat wasn't known for theatrics, but when the camera rolled, she sat forward, calm and steady, and delivered a message with the force of a tidal wave. "This isn't about safety," she said. "It's about selective cruelty, written in ink and passed off as law. They're not banning crime. They're banning compassion." She didn't blink. You can't use a badge to erase someone's humanity. That's not justice. That's cowardice dressed as courage. In the studio, even the host sat in stunned silence. The next day, news networks couldn't stop replaying her words. Governors were asked to take sides. Cities braced for legal battles. And in the CNN control room, a producer leaned over to her colleague and whispered, "Get them both. One night, one debate. Let America decide who's right." And so, a date was set. Not just for a political confrontation, but for a national reckoning. The countdown had begun. The country hadn't just heard Jasmine Crockett. They had felt her. And now, just days later, all eyes turned to a single stage, where the tension that had shaken state houses and split dinner tables would finally be put to the test. The studio was built for moments like this. Cold lights, red velvet seats, and an audience pulsing with anticipation. CNN's headquarters in Washington, D.C. had never felt so charged. Outside, barricades held back protesters and supporters alike, their chants clashing in the crisp night air. Inside, producers whispered final cues into earpieces while the countdown flashed on monitors. Live in 3, 2. Then came the music, dramatic and urgent, and the camera swept across a packed crowd. Mayors, lawyers, immigrant families, political junkies, and silent watchers who understood something far bigger was at stake tonight. This wasn't just a policy debate. This was a battle for America's moral compass. Governor Kelly Ayotte was introduced first. She walked onto the stage with a practiced smile and upright posture, her tailored blazer gleaming under the stage lights. Applause broke out immediately from one side of the room. Her supporters stood and clapped with sharp, calculated pride. She waved once, nodded confidently, and took her seat. The air thickened. Then the announcer's voice echoed again. "Please welcome Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." The response was different. There were cheers, yes, but deeper than that, a reverent silence as she stepped into the spotlight. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. Jasmine walked calmly, almost deliberately, and when she reached center stage, she turned to the crowd and gave a single silent nod. The host stepped forward, the tension crackling around her like static. She glanced at both women, then straight into the camera lens. Her voice was steady, solemn, and impossible to ignore. Good evening, America. Tonight, we aren't just discussing policy. We're asking a question much heavier than law. What kind of nation do we become when fear writes the rules and humanity is redacted? The room held its breath. This is not just about sanctuary cities. It's about what, if anything, we still owe each other. She paused. Governor Kelly Ayotte, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Let's begin. The moderator gave a nod. The studio lights narrowed like a spotlight on a stage set for war, and the first shot came exactly as expected, from the woman who had made this law her banner. Governor Kelly Ayotte didn't hesitate. With practiced confidence, she leaned forward, fingers interlaced on the table, as if her hands alone held the balance of justice. Her voice, trained and measured, rang out across the hall, clear, assertive, almost sterile in its control. Sanctuary City, she declared, are not safe havens. They are hiding places for criminals. The sentence struck like a gavel, designed not just to inform but to condemn. And when leaders refuse to enforce the law, she continued, they endanger the very people they were elected to protect. Her face was firm, eyes scanning the audience for confirmation, knowing the cameras were framing her as the woman of order, of authority, of reason. This law is not about hate, it's about order. It's about honoring the contract between government and its citizens. Applause erupted from the section of conservative supporters seated on the right. It was sharp, structured, a wave of validation carefully timed for television. Ayotte smiled, quick, mechanical, satisfied. We don't get to pick and choose which laws to follow, she concluded, and we certainly don't get to sacrifice safety for sentimentality. The applause lingered a moment too long, until Jasmine Crockett leaned back slightly in her chair and turned her full attention to Ayotte. Her silence at first was louder than any words. No flinch, no folder, just eyes locked in a calm, steeled breath. Then, with deliberate quiet that silenced the room, she answered. You're using the law to legalize indifference, she said, her tone even. Deliberate, but edged with something deeper, disgust restrained by discipline. And history won't remember it kindly. Her words didn't crash. They carved. Each syllable carried the weight of someone who had seen what those laws looked like in real life, up close, in tears and handcuffs. This isn't about protecting people, she added, gaze unwavering. This is about making sure the only voices that matter are the ones you already agree with. There was no need for a dramatic pause, because the audience gave her one. The reaction came not in a roar, but in an honest, visceral eruption. Applause this time wasn't neat. It came from the gut. It came from teachers, nurses, immigrants, students, those who knew the sound of truth when they heard it. Ayotte straightened slightly, jaw tightening. Then Jasmine moved with precision. She reached into her folder, not to stall, not to search, but to show, and lifted a thin document for the camera to catch. Do you know what these numbers say? She asked, her voice now a sharpened scalpel. That's sanctuary jurisdictions, by the government's own data, have 18% lower violent crime rates than cities forced to comply with ICE detainers. A few gasps broke through the silence. Jasmine held the report in one hand like a mirror. So either the math is lying, or the narrative is. And in that moment, the atmosphere shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, but irrevocably. Eyes once glazed in political routine were now focused. Journalists scribbled faster. Some audience members leaned in. Others leaned back. But no one looked away. The applause from earlier had ended, replaced by something much rarer in a room full of politics. Doubt. And in that quiet, it became clear. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just debating Kelly Ayotte. She was challenging the frame itself, and for the first time all evening, the governor looked unsettled. Fan ba, im lang saun hong kon so kwa Jasmine la dai, hong fai boy su kong chak chan, ma boy su nan tuk. Yet Governor Kelly Ayotte didn't reach for more data. She reached for something darker, a story not meant to inform, but to haunt. She adjusted her microphone with a slow, deliberate motion, her jaw tightening as the lights caught the edge of her profile. There was a practiced sadness in her voice, the kind that makes headlines and halts conversations. "Let me tell you about Maria Johnson," she began, her tone deliberately stripped of theatrics, meant to signal this was fact, undeniable, inarguable. A single mother, 32 years old. She worked 2 jobs, day shifts at the diner, night shifts at the nursing home, all so her 8-year-old son could have a better life. She looked down briefly, then up again, locking eyes with the camera. One night, walking home from work, just 2 blocks from her apartment, she was attacked, stabbed, in the back alley of her own neighborhood. The studio was silent. No one moved. Her words became slower now, heavier, each one placed like a brick in a wall of blame. Her killer was a man who had been deported twice. Twice, she said again, letting the repetition land like a gavel. But because the city where he was arrested refused to honor ICE's request to hold him, because they declared themselves a sanctuary, he walked free. And days later, Maria died. The audience didn't gasp, didn't cheer. It was the kind of silence that demanded response but dared you to interrupt. "That," Kelly said, her voice cracking slightly for effect, "is what happens when compassion overrides caution." Now she turned deliberately to face Jasmine and the audience all at once. Her posture stiffened, her delivery shifted back to the tone of a prosecutor delivering a final argument. "Maria's family will never see her again. Her son will grow up without a mother. And all because someone decided empathy mattered more than enforcement." Her fingers tapped the edge of her notes once, punctuating the pause. "This is the reality we're ignoring. When we refuse to enforce our immigration laws, we're not being progressive, we're being reckless." Applause came from the right side of the audience, measured but more energized than before. Supporters clung to the story like a shield, something they could point to and say, "See?" Kelly's tone lifted. One final strike. "No one is above the law, and no one gets to put personal emotion above public safety." It was a sentence meant to seal the moment, a line crafted to end the debate by invoking the ultimate currency in politics, fear wrapped in grief. But across from her, Jasmine Crockett didn't reach for her papers. She didn't look shaken. She simply stared, not at Kelly but past the performance, past the applause, into the void between law and justice. And she waited, because she knew stories like Maria's are real. But so are the stories America never lets women like Maria's killer tell. And she was about to speak for them. Ayotte's final words still echoed across the studio like the aftermath of a gavel strike. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't flinch. Because some truths are too heavy to interrupt with applause. Jasmine Crockett sat completely still, her expression unreadable, her shoulders squared not in defiance, but in endurance. The silence that followed wasn't a pause. It was a decision, a deliberate withholding of reaction, as though she were choosing whether this moment deserved fury or something far colder. Clarity. Her hands didn't twitch. Her eyes didn't break. She looked past the cameras, past the bright lights and applause lines, and into the space where real people live, where fear isn't political and law isn't theory. Then she exhaled slowly, and her voice emerged, low, steady, and utterly unshaken. "And Tawan," she began, her tone carved from something deeply personal, "doesn't mean being quiet when the law is hurting children." The words struck like a quiet alarm. No hysteria, just the truth stated plainly, unbearably. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her restraint made every word heavier. Safety doesn't come from locking up pain and pretending it doesn't bleed under uniforms. The sentence was slow, surgical, as if she were peeling back the surface of the debate to show what pulsed beneath it. The human cost no one wanted to name. The audience was silent, no longer a crowd, but a room holding its collective breath. "We cannot confuse order with justice," she continued, each word chiseled from lived experience. "And we can't call ourselves brave if we stay silent while the law devours the innocent." There was no flourish, No theatrical gesture, just Jasmine, arms at her side, voice as even as it was damning. She let the quiet settle again, not to dramatize, but because there was nothing more to prove, only something to witness. I've seen what this kind of law does, she said finally. I've watched 6-year-olds beg for their fathers. I've sat with mothers who were afraid to go to the ER because they might be handcuffed instead of helped. Her voice cracked slightly, not from emotion she couldn't control, but from truth she couldn't soften. So don't talk to me about safety, she said at last, turning her gaze now, firm, exacting, toward Kelly Ayotte. Not when it's bought by crushing the voiceless. The room didn't react at first, it absorbed. Because what Jasmine Crockett had just delivered wasn't a rebuttal. It was a quiet dismantling of a narrative too clean to be true, and everyone knew it. Her final sentence hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Not when it's bought by crushing the voiceless. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. Because some voices, no matter how small, never leave you, and some wounds don't bleed. They whisper. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't glance at the cameras or the audience. Instead, she lowered her voice as though she were speaking into a smaller room, one with no lights, no applause, just memory and responsibility. Let me tell you what that looks like, she began, each word deliberate, chosen not to provoke, but to reveal. I was in Texas, border town, volunteering. Her hands stayed still on the desk, but her voice trembled. Not from emotions she couldn't control, but from truths she could no longer protect anyone from. There was this girl, 6 years old. They had her sitting in one of those oversized plastic chairs, feet swinging off the edge like she was waiting for story time instead of an interview about her missing parent. The room didn't move. No one dared to. She looked up at me and said, Ko oi bachauji jiao roy. Jasmine let the words hang in their original language before continuing. Ma'am, where did my dad go? Her voice softened, but not because she was holding back. It softened like a hand brushing the surface of a scar. And what do you say to that? She asked quietly. How do you explain to a child that her father didn't disappear because he was a bad man, but because our system decided he was expendable? She drew in a breath, not for drama, but for the discipline to keep going. You lie, that's what you do. You lie because telling her the truth would mean confirming her worst fear, that her father vanished not for what he did, but for what he was. She paused. Her eyes scanned the room. And you lie because you can't bear to tell a child that in the eyes of the law, her family was never meant to be permanent. Still, she didn't stop there. Jasmine inhaled again, this time heavier, slower. There was another girl, she said, eyes fixed on the floor now, as if seeing her in real time. 11 years old, trying to act older than she was, like the fear made her grow up too fast. She'd been taken from her parents after a raid. ICE doesn't knock. They don't say goodbye. They don't explain. Her voice grew firmer now, shaped by anger earned through experience. I sat across from her. Her hands were folded in her lap. She kept blinking fast, trying not to cry. She looked me straight in the eye and asked, Ba chao bi bat vi lam ju, xiao jung hong. Jasmine blinked once, and when she translated, her voice barely rose above a whisper. My dad got taken because he did something bad. Right? She didn't look up yet. And I had to lie to her too, Jasmine said with a weight that filled the room. I had to say, no, sweetheart, he didn't. Because the truth would have taken away what little peace she had left. Because no child should have to wonder whether their parent was deservedly disappeared. Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the violence of empathy. It cracked like the edge of a dam that had held back too much for too long. Now the studio was utterly still. You could hear breaths being held. The air had changed. The temperature had dropped. Somewhere near the front row, a woman pressed a tissue to her cheek. A man next to her gripped the edge of his seat like he needed something to hold on to. The cameras moved slower, zoomed tighter. Jasmine Crockett didn't perform. She testified. Then finally she looked up. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. A law that makes children lose sleep out of fear, she said, voice even, voice final, isn't a law. The pause that followed was seismic. It's punishment, dressed up in administrative language. She said it without blinking, without decoration, just truth, clear, cold, irreversible. She didn't wait for a reaction. She didn't need one. Because she had said the one thing no one else in the room could deny, that justice without mercy is not justice at all. And in that moment, it didn't matter what side anyone came in supporting, because every single person in that studio had just been reminded what the stakes really were. Jasmine's voice had just pulled back the curtain on fear with the eyes of a child, but now she shifted, not away from emotion, but toward undeniable fact. Because in the court of public truth, empathy was the preamble, but evidence would be the verdict. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Instead, Jasmine reached into her folder, retrieved a single sheet of paper, and held it up with both hands, like someone presenting a document that didn't just contain words but warnings. The camera zoomed in as the paper trembled ever so slightly under the studio lights, not from her nerves, but from the weight of what it carried. "This," she said, calm and clear, "is a letter signed by 135 sheriffs across this country. Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, people who don't always agree, but who agree on this. Forcing local police to work like immigration officers doesn't make us safer." She paused to let the sentence breathe, scanning the room slowly, deliberately. These are sheriffs. They wear the badge. They answer 911 calls. They see what really happens on the ground. And even they are warning us. This kind of law will backfire. She unfolded the page on the table, flattening it with her palm as if it needed grounding. They're not warning us about Washington or protesters. They're warning us about what happens when we let fear decide how we treat people. Her voice lowered, not weakened, but sharpened, like a whisper that cuts deeper than a scream. When ICE detainers are mandatory, when cities are forced to follow one script, no matter the context, we don't create safety, we create silence. She looked into the crowd now, her eyes holding steady on no one and everyone at once. When people stop calling the police, when they're too scared to report what they've seen, crimes don't go away. They just go unreported. She let the pause hang. It wasn't empty, it was strategic. A silence loaded with consequence. Women in abusive homes stop calling for help, not because they don't want protection, but because they're more afraid of being deported than staying in danger. Kids who see things they shouldn't stay quiet because uniforms don't mean safety to them. They mean separation. Jasmine's tone darkened, not in volume, but in clarity. And we act surprised when neighborhoods stop trusting the system? That's not a mystery. That's a result. She stepped aside slightly as the screen behind her lit up with bold white text. 135 sheriffs oppose mandatory ICE cooperation. Below it, counties scrolled. Rural, urban, battleground states, red and blue. Jasmine gestured to it without theatrics. This isn't just a political opinion. This is law enforcement saying, we can't keep people safe if they're scared of us. Her hands were steady now, her voice iron-wrapped. When police start making people afraid just because of who they are or where they came from, she said, that's when democracy starts to fall apart. The room held still, not out of shock, but reverence, because she wasn't giving an opinion. She was drawing a fracture line in real time. You can't build strong communities by making people suspicious of their neighbors, she said slowly, as if cementing each word into the floor beneath her. You can't expect trust from people you threaten, and you can't call it justice if all you're doing is punishing people just for existing. The screen behind her began to dim again, but the weight of the names on it remained, as if still glowing in the air. She turned back toward Ayotte, not with contempt, but with the full gravity of someone who'd done her homework and lived the consequences. If you want to talk about safety, Jasmine continued, not flinching, not softening, don't just bring stories that scare people. Bring the people who actually do the job and are brave enough to say this isn't working. And then the final strike, her voice lower now, colder, the kind of calm that only comes from deep, unwavering truth. Because law without trust is not order, it's control. And control without justice is not America. No one clapped. They were too busy realizing how much had already cracked. The silence following Jasmine's dismantling of fear and mistrust hadn't faded. It had deepened, becoming the kind of quiet that demands a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett, eyes steady and voice unshaken, was about to deliver one. She didn't lean back. She didn't blink. Jasmine sat tall, hands folded, as the weight of the moment shifted visibly in the room. She turned her head, not quickly, not with aggression, but with that measured stillness that lands harder than a shout. Her eyes found Kelly Ayotte and didn't waver. No preface, no build-up. Just a question, quiet and devastating. "Let me ask you something simple." The audience froze. "If a single mother from Guatemala comes to New Hampshire, fleeing domestic abuse, no criminal record, terrified and alone, and she walks into a police station begging for help, will your officers arrest her?" Jasmine didn't blink. "Because that's what your law allows, Governor." The words didn't land like bullets. They landed like truth, slow, dense, and inescapable. You could feel it, the shift in breath, the sudden stillness of the moderator, the tightening grip of viewers across the country. The story Jasmine painted wasn't hypothetical, it was real. You could see the woman in your mind, worn jeans, trembling hands, clinging to a little girl in a borrowed coat, coming to the very people she'd been told would protect her, and being met not with help but with handcuffs. Kelly's face twitched, just slightly. She didn't answer. She adjusted her microphone, looked briefly toward the moderator, then to the camera, then back to her notes. She spoke, but not to the question. "We have laws for a reason," she began. "We are a nation of rules. We can't allow emotions to determine enforcement." It was polished, it was political, but it wasn't an answer. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She said nothing. And Jasmine saw it. Everyone did. She leaned in slightly, but her voice dropped, gentler, graver. "This isn't politics anymore," she said. "This is a question about who we are." She didn't raise her volume, but the room got smaller. "You had a chance to draw a line, right here tonight, a chance to say, 'No, we won't punish people for asking to be safe.'" Her gaze didn't shift. "And you couldn't take it." Her tone wasn't cruel. It was disappointed, deeply, unapologetically. "This isn't about party, it's about decency." The audience didn't move. There were no gasps, no applause, just silence. The kind that follows after something true has been said, and no one dares pretend otherwise. Kelly Ayotte had chosen policy. Jasmine Crockett had chosen humanity. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone watching, only one of them had shown up for the woman in that police station. As Jasmine's final words faded into the silence she left behind, the studio didn't reset, it recalibrated. The air was heavier, the stakes were clearer, and even off camera, the fallout had already begun. The stage lights dimmed for the scheduled commercial break, but no one moved like it was routine. Producers whispered frantically through earpieces, camera operators kept rolling just in case, and the audience remained seated, not out of obedience, but because standing felt disrespectful to what had just happened. On screens in the lobby and around the world, CNN's Breaking Chyron flashed in red. Jasmine Crockett shakes the town hall to its core. The words weren't hype, they were report. Minutes earlier, viewers were watching a debate. Now they were witnessing something closer to a shift in public conscience. In the control room, the executive producer leaned toward the director, voice low but urgent. "We need a second segment." She just flipped the frame. In real time, Twitter lit up like a command center. Hashtags climbed, but what cut through wasn't noise. It was clarity. A Harvard constitutional law professor tweeted just 7 words, and those words landed like a gavel across digital America. "Crockett just taught this country the line, where law meets morality." It wasn't just praise, it was indictment, aimed squarely at those who had forgotten the difference. Other voices followed, civil rights attorneys, pastors, public defenders, retweeting, quoting, adding context. This is what speaking truth sounds like. This is why we elect people who've lived it. Backstage, Jasmine sat alone for a moment, not with handlers or staff, but with the echo of her own restraint. Her phone buzzed endlessly in her bag. She didn't check it. Her hands were still, resting on her knees. For all her control on stage, the truth was visible now. That silence she'd carried during Ayotte's non-answer, wasn't just political, it was personal, because she knew what it felt like to ask a question about someone's humanity and be met with silence that screamed. She wasn't gloating, she was grieving for the woman in her story, for every mother who wouldn't step into a police station tonight, and for the country still unsure whether it wanted to be brave or merely consistent. Meanwhile, in a green room down the hall, Kelly Ayotte scrolled through her own Twitter feed. The praise from conservative influencers was already coming in. Strong on law, clear-eyed, firm. But none of it was trending. What was trending was a photo. Jasmine, eyes fixed, hand raised, mouth open in mid-sentence. The moment she asked the question that Ayotte didn't answer. Captioned simply, "This is the line." And that image wasn't going anywhere. Because sometimes in politics, you don't need a winner. You just need someone who refused to look away. And Jasmine Crockett had become that person, on live television, in real time, with the nation watching and the system trembling. The break ended, but the tension did not. When the cameras came back on, the air inside the CNN studio was sharper, cutting, expectant. This wasn't just the final round, it was the final line. And everyone knew one of them was about to cross it. Governor Kelly Ayotte adjusted her blazer, cleared her throat, and leaned toward the mic with the precision of a politician who had said this before, and rehearsed saying it again. Her tone was smooth, her cadence tight, the kind of sentence engineered to sound unshakable. "At the end of the day," she said, eyes straight ahead, "the law is the law." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. It was the phrase she'd built her platform on, a mantra, a shield, a line that allowed no interpretation. Her voice didn't rise, her face didn't crack, but something in the audience did. Because after everything that had been said, that sentence, "the law is the law," no longer sounded like strength. It sounded like surrender. The moderator hesitated. For a second, she seemed unsure whether to close the segment or let it breathe. But she turned, one last time, to Jasmine Crockett. "Congresswoman," she said quietly, "final word." Jasmine didn't move immediately. She let the silence hang, not because she needed time, but because the silence now belonged to her. Then she spoke, slowly, clearly, the kind of voice that comes not from a script, but from conviction built in places law books don't reach. "Law," she said, "is just the boat." The audience held still. And if that boat drifts away from justice, if it carries us in the wrong direction, we don't polish it. We don't admire its structure. We break it, and we build another one. She stood then, not with theatrics, but because the moment asked for it. Her hand rested gently on the desk, her voice grounded in something far older than politics. "That," she said, locking eyes with the camera, "is the America I swore to defend." The words didn't explode. They landed. And they didn't need volume, because they carried weight. For a second, nothing happened. No clapping, no sound. Just the echo of that final line. And then from the left side of the studio, one person stood. Then another. And then the room rose. One row, then two, then all of them. The applause wasn't frantic, it wasn't political, it was something else. It was release. A full minute passed. 60 seconds of hands crashing together, of people forgetting the cameras were still rolling, of a nation, if only for a moment, remembering what courage in public looked like. Even the moderator was quiet, her mouth slightly open, her card notes forgotten in her hand. Ayotte didn't stand. She remained seated, eyes fixed forward, lips pressed together. Her line, "The law is the law," sounded smaller now. Not because it wasn't true, but because it had been answered. Not just with words, but with will. Back in the control room, producers exchanged glances. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They knew what they had just filmed wasn't a debate, it was a declaration. The lighting didn't change. The camera angles didn't shift. But something fundamental had. Jasmine Crockett hadn't delivered a closing remark. She had drawn a map out of fear, out of silence, out of obedience. And she'd done it by refusing to let the law be the ceiling, when it was always meant to be the floor. And somewhere, far from the studio, in a small living room in Arizona, or an apartment in New Jersey, Someone who had once feared stepping into a courthouse saw her, heard her, and for the first time in years, they felt like maybe, just maybe, someone in that system was finally speaking for them. As the final applause faded into memory and the studio lights cooled, what had begun as a policy debate was already spiraling into something seismic. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just owned the moment. She had detonated a fault line, and the aftershocks were immediate. The morning after the town hall wasn't business as usual. Newsrooms didn't just report, they recalibrated. Headlines didn't lead with legislation, they led with resistance. Before noon, 12 mayors from across New Hampshire, Democrats, independents, and even 2 Republicans, stood on the steps of their city halls and declared in unison that they would not enforce HB 511 or SB 62. Their language was careful, legal, but firm. "We are public servants, not border agents," one said. "We do not build trust by turning fear into policy." It was the kind of open defiance that governors aren't used to. And Kelly Ayotte, less than 24 hours removed from her national platform, now found her home state fracturing beneath her feet. The mayor of Portsmouth took it further. Surrounded by reporters and flanked by clergy and immigrant advocates, she said, "We watched last night." We heard both women. Only one of them looked like she had ever sat across from someone afraid to call the police. And with that, the line was drawn. Towns like Dover, Keene, Lebanon, and Claremont released joint statements by the hour. They would not comply with ICE detainers issued without judicial warrants. They would not hold mothers, witnesses, or teenage boys on vague suspicion. "Not in our cities," they said, "not in our name." In Washington, the shift moved even faster. By midday, 3 members of the House Judiciary Committee had submitted a formal request for an emergency hearing on the constitutionality of HB 511. Staffers scrambled to pull case law. Legal scholars were contacted. Former DOJ officials tweeted in capital letters, "This bill is federally questionable at best and morally catastrophic at worst." Meanwhile, the ACLU's litigation team confirmed they had already drafted a lawsuit naming the state of New Hampshire and Governor Ayotte as defendants. Jasmine's performance wasn't just a speech, it had triggered a legal domino, and now federal scrutiny was unavoidable. In the CNN newsroom, a special programming team gathered around an impromptu war room of glowing monitors and open Slack threads. One senior producer turned from her screen, visibly stunned. "This wasn't a town hall," she muttered. "This was a turning point." Moments later, the network issued a formal statement, both on air and across digital platforms. It didn't mince words. Tonight's debate belonged to Jasmine Crockett, not because she shouted louder, but because she spoke deeper. In every room where fear used to live, her voice now echoes. Jasmine Crockett, not Kelly Ayotte, owned the night. The clip of Jasmine's closing line, "If the law drifts from justice, break it and build again," was now being replayed every 20 minutes, on cable, on social media, on phone screens across the country. People weren't just listening, they were responding. In Chicago, a city councilwoman called for a local review of police-ICE cooperation. In Denver, an immigrant rights group put up a digital billboard showing Jasmine's face beside the words, "The law is not a cage, the law should be a bridge." A viral moment had metastasized into a national dialogue. Meanwhile, back in New Hampshire, something even more telling happened. Local police departments, some in quiet rural counties, others in college towns, began releasing statements of their own. Carefully worded but unmistakable, they would continue to uphold community policing standards. "We are not in the business of immigration enforcement," read one statement from the Concord Police Department. "Our job is to protect everyone, regardless of status." It wasn't rebellion, it was reaffirmation. Jasmine had made it safe to say what many had long whispered, and yet, amid the momentum, the pushback had begun too. Conservative radio lit up, calling the mayors traitors, accusing Crockett of grandstanding with activist tears. Ayotte's office released a terse statement insisting the laws reflect the will of the people and promising legal consequences for cities that obstruct compliance. But even among Ayotte's usual allies, the energy had shifted. Her own party strategists, speaking off the record, admitted they hadn't expected Crockett to cut through like that. One admitted, it wasn't a gotcha moment, it was moral clarity, and it hit a nerve. Inside Congress, Jasmine returned quietly to her office that evening, greeted not with a media scrum, but with voicemails from mayors, emails from police chiefs, and one handwritten letter from a fifth-grade class in San Antonio. Thank you for saying it out loud. She didn't celebrate. She didn't grandstand. She read, she replied, and she prepared, because the hearing wasn't the end. It was the next battle. As dusk fell on Capitol Hill, the Capitol dome glowed over a country in motion. For the first time in weeks, the question wasn't whether a law was passed. It was whether that law deserved to exist. And one voice, measured, fierce, unflinching, had cracked that question wide open. Jasmine Crockett hadn't waited for permission. She hadn't asked for applause. She had walked into the lion's den with receipts, with memories, and with the steadiness of someone who knew. And the country, tired, cynical, scared, had paused and listened. Not out of loyalty, but out of hope. The night had ended with thunderous applause, but by sunrise it was clear that the tremors hadn't stopped. Jasmine Crockett's words weren't just echoing, they were mobilizing, and the country woke up different. At 6 a.m., America didn't ease into the news cycle. It collided with it. Across the screens of millions, the Chiron read the same, a political tipping point in the United States. On CNN, footage replayed Jasmine's final words under the banner, "The law is just the boat." MSNBC followed suit, opening their morning segment with, "Last night, the conversation around immigration didn't shift. It ruptured." Over on PBS, the language was more formal, but no less direct. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett may have reshaped how America discusses sanctuary policies and who gets to define justice. Even the BBC opened its international hour with a rare headline from the U.S. domestic front. In one night, a nation reconsiders its compass. The reaction wasn't just media, it was movement. In Boston, a press conference was called before most offices had even turned on their lights. Mayor Vanessa Chen stepped up to the podium outside City Hall, flanked by community leaders, clergy, immigration advocates, and two uniformed officers from Boston PD. They're not for security, but for solidarity. Cameras clicked. Reporters jostled. Chen didn't blink. "Let me make this plain," she said into a dozen microphones. "Boston will not be deputized by fear. We will not turn our neighbors into suspects." Her voice grew stronger with each sentence. "We will not comply with ICE detainer requests that come without judicial oversight. We will protect our undocumented communities, because safety doesn't start with fear. It starts with trust." The crowd behind her, immigrant families holding signs, students in Harvard sweatshirts, local union reps, erupted in cheers. A young mother from East Boston wept silently in the front row, her hands gripping the stroller of the son she almost didn't bring with her. Reporters fired questions, but Chen wasn't finished. "We watched the town hall last night," she said, "and we heard both women speak, but only one of them reminded us why we got into public service in the first place. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak for a party. She spoke for the people no one else wants to speak for, and in this city that still means something." Within the hour, other cities followed. Worcester, Cambridge, Somerville, mayors releasing statements, city councils calling emergency sessions. ICE cooperation agreements were placed under review, memorandums drafted to reassert local control over community policing. But the most jarring shift didn't come from the progressives. It came from those who rarely spoke on national issues. The mayor of Nashua, a registered independent, issued a 5-minute statement broadcast live on regional radio. "I've enforced a lot of laws," he said, "but I've also sat across from a mother holding a deportation notice in one hand and her daughter's report card in the other. That's not a threat to our country. That's our country begging us to act like it." Meanwhile, in Washington, the impact continued to swell. Senate aides began circulating Jasmine's transcript, printing lines from her speech in bold, underlined, passed hand to hand like contraband truths in a building grown numb to them. Congressional staffers who had dismissed the town hall as political theater were now watching clips on repeat. Her words, "If the law drifts from justice, break it and build again," were no longer just rhetoric. They were strategy. By 10 a.m., two sitting senators had called for a bipartisan review of ICE detainer protocol. By 11 o'clock, a third was asking whether HB 511 could survive constitutional scrutiny in light of federal overreach. Back in Boston, Mayor Chen's office issued a second statement before noon. This one was shorter, but it carried more weight. We're no longer waiting for Washington to act. We're protecting our residents now. The accompanying photo was of Jasmine Crockett, mid-sentence on the CNN stage, hand raised, not in defense, but in defiance. And for thousands watching from living rooms, break rooms, buses, and border shelters, that image was not just inspiring. It was instructive. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is ask a question the system refuses to answer, and keep asking it until something breaks. And that morning in coffee shops and courtrooms, in church basements and law school halls, something had broken. Not in a way that brought destruction, in a way that made space for reimagining, for redrawing, for rebuilding. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just shown the country what courage looked like. She had reminded it of something it had tried to forget, that the law was always meant to serve the people, not control them. And if it ever forgets that, then yes, break it and build again. As the ripples of the town hall turned into tidal waves across cities and state houses, the federal government could no longer look away. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just sparked a conversation. She had summoned Congress to its feet. And now, under the vaulted ceilings of the Capitol, the reckoning had come. The House Judiciary Committee chamber, normally a place of drawn-out debates and procedural yawns, had the gravity of a war room. Marble columns stood like sentinels behind the dais. Cameras lined the back wall. Every seat was filled. Staffers, reporters, aides leaning forward with pens frozen midair. At the witness table sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, not as a guest but as the catalyst. She wore no armor of political theater, no exaggerated gestures, no rhetorical gymnastics. Only clarity, only the truth. The chairperson gavelled the session to order. This hearing, he said, will examine the constitutional implications of House Bill 511 and the broader legal and moral responsibilities of federal and local cooperation in immigration enforcement. The tension didn't build. It was already thick. When Jasmine rose to speak, no one interrupted. The hush was immediate, reverent. She didn't read from notes. She didn't need to. She looked every committee member in the eye, then began, her voice level and low. Not every law is worthy of protection. A pause, a single beat. Some exist only to test the conscience of a nation. The words cut through the room like a clean blade. No excess, no filler. Staffers looked up from their phones. Even seasoned members who had planned to tune out leaned forward. We are told that laws are sacred, she continued. But if a law only survives by silencing the powerless, then we must ask whether it was ever worthy of survival at all. She held the silence after that line, not to dramatize, but to let the truth echo. Then she pressed forward. I've spoken with mothers too afraid to report domestic abuse. I've spoken with children who flinch at the sight of police, not because they did something wrong, but because someone they love was taken without warning, without a charge, without a reason that would stand in any other court. Her voice was not rising. It was narrowing, tightening into a force that could not be dismissed. HB 511 is not about public safety. It is about public fear. It gives cities the illusion of order by trading in the language of exclusion. A slide appeared behind her, authorized by the chair. Excerpts from the 135 sheriff's letter, now part of the congressional record. Jasmine turned slightly to gesture at it. These are not radicals. These are law enforcement professionals from every corner of this country. And they are telling you, this law will break trust. This law will make policing harder, not easier. She turned back. So I ask again, if our goal is safety, why are we passing laws that push the vulnerable into the shadows? The ranking member, a congressman known for his sharp tone in defense of immigration enforcement, looked ready to strike. But Jasmine didn't wait for him. She anticipated it. And for those who say this is just about following the rules, she said, pivoting without skipping a beat, let me remind you, Jim Crow was the law. Japanese internment was the law. Denying women the right to vote was the law. History doesn't ask whether something was legal. It asks whether it was just. A murmur passed through the gallery. Several staffers stopped typing. The chair leaned back, visibly shaken. Not by volume, but by moral clarity he couldn't pivot from. Jasmine then brought it back down, not to soften, but to center. HB 511 does not define what kind of country we are. It defines what kind of country we're willing to tolerate. Her hands rested flat on the table. And if this body exists to defend the Constitution, then it must also defend the people it was written to protect. Not just the documented, not just the privileged, but the human being who shows up at a station terrified, holding nothing but her child's hand and the hope that America will still live up to its name. Silence again. Not out of hesitation, but out of respect. One of the committee members, a veteran from a conservative district, looked down at the letter in front of him, folded it in half, and placed it face down. Jasmine sat down. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't spoken a word more than necessary, but she had changed the temperature of the room, and everyone in it knew it. That morning, in a building that had heard thousands of testimonies, someone had finally spoken not for her own defense, but for the people who never got through the metal detectors. And in that hearing under oath, Jasmine Crockett did what few had dared in that room. She refused to mistake legality for justice, and she made sure the record would never forget it. The congressional hearing had left a tremor in its wake, but what came next was not another political fight. It was a return to the beginning. 1 week later, Jasmine Crockett didn't stand before lawmakers or media cameras. She stood before the next generation of justice, and this time, she didn't come to defend. She came to redefine. The auditorium at Howard University School of Law was packed to the rafters. Students crammed shoulder to shoulder, lining staircases, leaning against walls, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Professors stood in the aisles, some with notepads in hand, others simply holding their breath. It wasn't just a lecture, it was an event. Outside, the line of people who couldn't get in wrapped around the courtyard, silent and expectant. Inside, the lights dimmed and a single spotlight fell on the podium where Jasmine Crockett stood. No teleprompter, no notes. Just her, in a room pulsing with history. She didn't open with policy. She didn't lead with applause lines. Instead, she stepped up to the microphone, gripped both sides of the podium, and told a story. A few years ago, she began, her voice slow, deliberate. I sat across from a little girl, 6 years old, big eyes, dirty sneakers. Ice had taken her father 2 nights before. She looked down for half a second, then back up. And she asked me, very quietly, why did they take my dad? Did he do something bad? The auditorium froze. And in that moment, I realized something, she continued. I didn't have the luxury of doing politics the way it's always been done. The silence wasn't stunned. It was reverent. Students leaned forward, not out of curiosity, but from the gravity of recognition. Jasmine's voice didn't rise. It deepened. I couldn't walk into rooms anymore and pretend laws were just words, she said, because to her, those words had already taken her family. And if my job was just to defend the system that did that to her, then what the hell was I doing here? Her jaw tensed, her grip on the podium tighter now. You all came to law school to learn how to fight for what's right, she said. But I'm telling you, if the law only lives on paper, if it dies in people's hearts, we've already failed. A gasp rippled through the crowd, not of shock, but of validation. Jasmine looked across the faces in front of her, young and burning with questions, and gave them permission to ask more. You're going to be told that your job is to interpret the law, she said, but I'm asking you to go further. Ask who it serves, ask who it silences, ask who it's afraid of. She paused, then added, and if the answer doesn't sit right with your soul, rewrite it. That's your right. That's your duty. That's your power. The applause started slowly, one corner of the room, then another, and then it swelled, crashing over the space like a wave. Jasmine waited, nodded once, then leaned back in. You don't need permission to change this country, she said. You need memory. You need rage. And you need love. The kind of love that makes you stay in the room when it would be easier to walk away. Her eyes glistened now, but no tears fell. I stayed, and I keep staying, not because it's easy, but because that little girl still deserves an answer. By the time she stepped away from the podium, the entire auditorium was on its feet. Professors cried openly. Students clapped until their hands burned. The moment didn't feel rehearsed, it felt released. Raw, honest, unshakable. By nightfall, the video of her speech had already been clipped, captioned, uploaded, and shared across every platform. On Instagram, it was stitched with scenes of protest and solidarity. On TikTok, law students reenacted her lines. On YouTube, it was streamed by the millions. In 72 hours, it crossed 50 million views worldwide. But numbers weren't the point. What mattered was the ripple it carried. A generation of young lawyers, activists, teachers, and parents who now saw the law not as a cage to enforce, but as a promise to uphold. Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak to a room, she handed them a torch, and the fire it lit couldn't be unlit. As the standing ovation at Howard slowly settled into history, Jasmine Crockett returned to Washington with a fire still burning quietly behind her eyes. But it wasn't a senator's handshake or a headline that would pierce her most deeply. It was the handwritten voice of someone she'd never met. The letter came in a plain white envelope, no return address, the handwriting uneven but careful. Each letter a quiet act of hope. Her staff found it in a bundle of morning mail, tucked between news clippings and policy memos. They nearly missed it. But Jasmine, sitting by her office window, sorting through the chaos that followed her speech, paused when she saw the smudged ink and the neat little stamp from Silver Spring, Maryland. She opened it slowly, instinctively, like something sacred. Inside was a single piece of lined paper, folded twice and written in blue pen. Dear Congresswoman Crockett, my name is Daniel. I'm 16 years old. I was born in El Salvador. I go to high school in Maryland now. My mom works in housekeeping. My older brother works nights to help pay rent. I watched your speech at Howard on my phone, and I cried. A lot. Because when you talked about the little girl who asked if her dad was a bad man, I thought about myself. I've asked that question every day since ICE took my uncle. And nobody ever gave me an answer I believed. Until you. You're the first person who made me feel like America has room for someone like me. Thank you. Don't stop. Daniel M. Jasmine read the letter 3 times before she said a word. The first time, she read it like a lawmaker, gathering the facts, absorbing the pain. The second time, she read it as a daughter, remembering the fear in her mother's voice when she was followed home once for speaking at a protest. The third time, she read it as herself, not the congresswoman, not the legal warrior, but just Jasmine, the black girl from Texas who once wondered if justice had a color, a border, a language. And suddenly, all of it, the hearings, the town hall, the standing ovations, collapsed into a single voice. His. She looked up, blinking hard, her breath shaky but held. In that moment, no press cycle mattered. No trending tag, no poll number. What mattered was that a boy who had been told in every subtle and brutal way that he didn't belong had watched her speak and for the first time believed he might. That was the verdict, not handed down by a judge, but delivered quietly in blue ink from a boy still trying to find his place in a country that never guaranteed him one. Later that day, Jasmine walked into a closed-door strategy session on immigration reform. Advisors talked fast. Language was being negotiated. Humane enforcement, pathway, non-cooperation protocols. But Jasmine wasn't listening the same way anymore. She reached into her bag, unfolded Daniel's letter, and placed it flat on the table. Read this, she said. This is who we're writing laws for. Not the headlines, not the donors. Him. The room fell quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't happen in politics unless truth has just entered the room, uninvited and undeniable. The letter stayed there for the rest of the meeting, unmoving, unchallenged, untouchable. One staffer snapped a photo, quietly, and texted it to a colleague with the message. This is what conviction looks like. And outside the Capitol, across cities, classrooms, and courtrooms, Daniel's words would echo, not because they were loud, but because they were clear. You're the first person who made me feel like America has room for someone like me. And Jasmine Crockett knew, if she did nothing else in her career, That one sentence had already made everything worth it. Because justice doesn't always begin in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins on notebook paper, folded twice, mailed with courage, and answered with everything you've got. The letter from Daniel didn't just close a chapter. It opened a wound Jasmine had carried quietly her entire career. But through that pain came something else. The lesson she had been walking toward all along. The human lesson was never written in statute or case law. It lived in the space between the law's intention and its impact. Jasmine Crockett had entered politics believing she could reconcile the two. But what she discovered in courtrooms and detention centers, in whispered confessions from terrified mothers and trembling teenagers, was that some systems are built not to protect, but to survive themselves. And when a system survives by silencing pain, it creates a country where fear becomes invisible currency. Jasmine had tried to play by the rules. She passed bills. She studied the codes. She stood silent during roll calls that made her sick. But it wasn't until she saw a child stare at her and ask why their father disappeared that she realized law is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of accountability. The injustice she faced wasn't loud, it was procedural. It came with polite nods and parliamentary language. It came when colleagues told her to be pragmatic, when leadership warned her not to speak too personally. But how do you talk about broken families without being personal? How do you debate a policy that makes children afraid to sleep and pretend it's just about jurisdiction? The cruelty was never in the shouting. It was in the indifference. And that indifference, more than hatred, is what Jasmine set out to destroy. The lesson was this, that neutrality in the face of cruelty is not professionalism, it's betrayal. That a law, no matter how constitutional, is immoral the moment it asks you to be less human in order to obey it. Jasmine came to understand that the people who suffer under bad laws are often the ones least able to challenge them, and that it is the responsibility of those with a microphone, a seat at the table, or even a single page of testimony to make that suffering visible, to make it impossible to ignore. That was why she stood on that stage. That was why she walked into the hearing room, not to win, but to witness. And the truth she left with, the one she carried now like a scar and a shield, was that change never comes from the center, it comes from the margins, from the overlooked, from the detained, from the deported, from the classroom where a boy writes in imperfect English, "You're the first person who made me feel like I belong." It comes from memory and grief, and the will to speak louder than silence. Jasmine had learned that justice is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers. But if you're brave enough to hear it, you'll never be able to unhear it again. So the lesson wasn't just for her, it was for everyone watching. That justice doesn't require power. It requires courage. It doesn't begin in court. It begins the moment you stop pretending laws are enough. The moment you understand that if compassion costs you your seat, it was never your seat to keep. That being remembered as someone who stood alone in the right is more powerful than standing with everyone else in the wrong. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the system, she exposed it. And in doing so, she gave us all a blueprint, not just for legal reform, but for human redemption. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a packed ballroom in Charlotte, Jasmine Crockett confronts Councilwoman Ayotte Brown over $115,000 in missing COVID relief funds, meant for the dying, spent on thrones and champagne. As survivors speak and receipts roll, the room turns from celebration to courtroom, and the truth ignites a fire no one can extinguish. Power built on silence is about to face the one woman who refuses to look away. But when justice finally speaks, will it roar loud enough to bury the lies, or will the world look away again? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It began like a scene ripped from a surreal dream, or a nightmare, depending on where you stood. A video surfaced late Friday night and spread like wildfire by morning. Charlotte Councilwoman Ayotte Brown, descending from a white horse-drawn carriage, draped in a sequined gold gown, waving like royalty to a paid crowd of influencers and local elites. The camera panned across a lavish garden estate where a massive golden throne sat at the center of a marble dais. Velvet ropes lined the perimeter, and uniformed servers handed out champagne flutes and glittering gift bags stuffed with Louis Vuitton merchandise. A banner flapped above the crowd. "A queen deserves a coronation." In the video, Brown raised her glass and smiled, declaring, "This is for the women who made it through the fire." But across town, the fire was still burning. For the single mothers in East Charlotte waiting on food aid that never came. For the war veterans evicted during lockdowns. For the essential workers who never had a day off. As the video racked up hundreds of thousands of views, the backlash began to roar. The real gut punch came with the leaked finance report showing that $115,000 in federal COVID relief funds had been siphoned, funneled through a shell nonprofit, and used to finance this grotesque spectacle. In a break room at Presbyterian Medical Center, under flickering fluorescent lights and the faint stench of antiseptic, Nurse Marisol Herrera slammed her coffee down and whispered, "She used our money for that?" Her hands still smelled faintly of bleach and nitrile gloves. She'd pulled 3 back-to-back 16-hour shifts that week. Marisol, Jasmine Crockett's former college roommate, had buried 6 patients during the Delta wave and never received the hazard pay her contract had promised. Her voice cracked. "I worked through hell, through bodies stacked in hallways. I wore garbage bags as PPE. Meanwhile, she's out here with thrones and champagne?" Jasmine listened silently, her jaw clenched, fists balled in her coat pockets. She hadn't blinked once since the video began. For her, this wasn't just about Tijuana Brown anymore. It was about every official who smiled at cameras while bleeding the people dry behind closed doors. "This isn't a party," Jasmine muttered under her breath, fire flickering behind her eyes. "It's an insult, a national one." The war had just become personal. Jasmine didn't sleep that night, not out of rage but resolve. Because when a throne is built on the backs of the suffering, someone has to burn it down, brick by brick, lie by lie. The email arrived without warning. No greeting, no signature, just a blank subject line and a single line of text that felt more like a command than a suggestion. "Follow the wire transfers." It was the kind of message you don't get by accident. Jasmine hesitated for a moment before opening the attachments, already suspecting what she was about to see, already dreading that she might be right. The first PDF was a clean-cut ledger, official allocations of federal COVID relief funds marked for community aid, housing stabilization, medical outreach. But as she clicked through the next files, the numbers began to bend and break. The money didn't stay in the programs it was assigned to. Instead, thousands of dollars were funneled from official city accounts into a small nonprofit named Healing Futures Initiative, registered just 8 weeks earlier. On paper, it was supposed to support post-COVID trauma counseling. In reality, its listed headquarters was a boarded-up nail salon in West Charlotte. The nonprofit's president? A woman with the last name Brown, first cousin to Councilwoman Tijuana Brown. Jasmine stared at the screen in silence, her breath growing slower, heavier. The further she read, the clearer the pattern became. Payment after payment justified by vague terms. Community empowerment package, outreach ceremony logistics, morale uplift. One invoice simply said, event seating plus regal elements. She didn't need to ask what that meant. The throne, the champagne, the show. Jasmine had fought long and hard to get to where she was. A black woman from the South Side who clawed her way through the legal system to hold power not for herself, but for those who had none. To see it abused this way, by someone who claimed to be part of that same fight, felt like a betrayal wrapped in silk. The kind that didn't just hurt, it corroded. By sunrise, Jasmine had canceled her meetings, cleared her schedule, and called in favors she hadn't touched in years. She met in a locked basement office with 2 people she trusted with her career. A forensic accountant who once uncovered embezzlement inside FEMA, and a retired IRS agent with a photographic memory and a hatred for dirty numbers. They didn't talk much. Jasmine pinned every document to a corkboard, drawing red lines between dates, vendors, aliases, mapping the theft like a prosecutor preparing for war. Phones were banned from the room, no email trails, no leaks, just a silent agreement. This ends here. Every file they uncovered reinforced the truth. This wasn't a slip-up. It was a system designed to exploit chaos. It was methodical. Money moved in loops, through names that didn't exist a year ago, all tied together by a thin thread of entitlement and impunity. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, eyes burning from the hours. Her voice was low when she finally spoke. "This isn't a party," she said. "It's an insult, a national one." 7 days passed, each night longer than the last. But when the file was complete, when every receipt, every signature, every pixel of evidence stood ready, Jasmine knew the stage had to be public. Not a backdoor inquiry, not a quiet resignation. No, if this empire was built on illusion, it had to fall in front of the very people it had deceived. To bring down a queen, she told her team, you don't strike at the court, you strike at the coronation. The evidence was locked, the strategy drawn. But justice doesn't live on paper. It breathes in the spotlight, where lies unravel under the heat of truth. And Jasmine knew exactly where that heat would burn brightest. The Charlotte Convention Center had never felt heavier. Beneath the soaring glass panels and velvet drapes, thousands of voices buzzed in anticipation. 2,000 women and men from across the country, seated row by row like chess pieces on a polished board. They came to witness greatness, to be inspired, to cheer for those who, in their eyes, had carried communities through catastrophe. Journalists swarmed the press pit, cameramen adjusted lenses with robotic precision, and aides flitted through the aisles handing out gold-foiled programs embossed with the title, Women of Color in Leadership, Rebuilding the Nation. On the center spread, a glossy headshot of Councilwoman Ayotte Brown beamed back, chin high, hands clasped, haloed in warm amber lighting. The caption beneath read, Post-Pandemic Community Architect. When her name was announced, the ovation shook the room. Ayotte walked onto the main stage in a plum-colored designer suit, custom fit and sharp at every seam. She waved to the crowd like a pageant queen, the picture of poise. Flashbulbs burst from every direction. Someone in the third row shouted, "We love you, Ayotte." She smiled graciously, accepting the adoration like it was her birthright. From the wings, Jasmine Crockett stood still. She didn't smile. She didn't clap. The file folder in her hand felt heavier than it should have. Her gaze never wavered. Not from the woman on stage, not from the screen above her head, and not from the words community architect, which now felt like a cruel joke scripted by spin doctors. Jasmine wasn't here for ceremony. She wasn't here to network or elevate her own name. She was here because the lie had grown bold enough to put on heels and walk into the spotlight. And no one was calling it what it was. She scanned the room. Every face out there had once lived in fear of the virus, of eviction, of being forgotten. They had come here to celebrate survival. They didn't know that one of the survivors on stage had climbed over their backs to get there. Jasmine had seen the numbers. She had followed the wires. She knew the truth behind the throne. And now she was next on the program, the keynote speaker scheduled to follow Ayotte Brown's coronation. She looked down at the agenda one last time, her name printed cleanly in bold beneath Ayotte's representative. Jasmine Crockett, the future of resilient leadership. There it was, destiny, inked and laminated. She hadn't come here to be polite. She hadn't flown in to pose for photos or sip mocktails with donors. She came because the lie was now standing center stage, wrapped in silk and framed as a savior. The moment was drawing near. The music swelled. Ayotte's voice rang out, rehearsed and confident. Jasmine listened, stone-faced. This wasn't ego. This wasn't ambition. This was a moral imperative. This wasn't just another event. This was the battlefield. She took one step toward the light. The crowd wouldn't be expecting confrontation. They came for celebration. But truth rarely sends out an RSVP. And as the MC's voice boomed out her name, Jasmine inhaled deeply. Jasmine wasn't there to preserve illusions. She was there to rip the curtain down before the nation, before the press, before the very people Ayotte had betrayed with a smile. The coronation was beginning, but the crown was already cracked. The applause still echoed from the ballroom, but in the backstage corridors, the air had turned electric, thick with tension, thicker with truth. This wasn't politics anymore. This was confrontation. And Jasmine didn't come to blink first. The green room was all artificial calm, muted beige walls, filtered air, a couch too clean to be comfortable. It smelled faintly of hairspray and nerves. Beyond the thick door, the distant pulse of the ballroom could still be felt, like the heartbeat of a stage play waiting for its climax. But inside this room, the show was already beginning, one without lights, scripts, or escape routes. Jasmine stepped in slowly, every movement deliberate, her body still but her presence unmistakable. Her breath was even, but her pulse was a war drum. She didn't need to raise her voice to fill the room. Opposite her, Tijuana Brown sat with one leg crossed over the other, head tilted, watching Jasmine with the expression of a queen indulging a court jester. A makeup artist dusted her cheekbone, but Tijuana waved her off with the flick of a manicured finger the moment Jasmine entered. There was a pause, 3 seconds too long to be casual. Then Jasmine spoke, not as a politician, not as a guest, but as a woman fed up with the theater of power. "Can you look me in the eye right now?" she said, her voice low and razor sharp, "and tell me that $115,000 didn't come from the blood and sweat of the people you claim to serve?" The silence after was dense enough to choke on. The question didn't need elaboration. It was pure. It was pointed. It was impossible to deflect without sounding like a fraud. But Tijuana, seasoned in public games, didn't flinch. She exhaled through her nose with the practiced grace of someone who had dodged worse. Slowly, she turned from the mirror and faced Jasmine head on, her eyes calculating every inch of the woman before her. Then she smiled, a cool, polished expression that felt less like warmth and more like armor. "Ms. Crockett," she said, deliberately dropping the formality like a blade, "I inspire people. I give them someone to believe in." She stepped forward, closing the distance, not in aggression, but with the confidence of someone used to owning the room. Jasmine didn't move. "And you? You flew all the way here to tear down a successful black woman in front of white cameras and rented applause? That's not justice. That's jealousy." The words were venomous, but they came wrapped in silk. There was no yelling, no chaos, only the unsettling quiet of two women who knew the stakes and knew exactly what was being played. One betting on legacy, image, and control. The other holding the truth like a lit match behind her back. Jasmine's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her presence alone said it all. This isn't a feud. This is a reckoning. And backstage, under sterile lights and a mountain of unspoken history, the first move had just been made. The backstage exchange had ended with silence, but Jasmine knew words alone wouldn't expose rot. To tear through illusion, she needed witnesses, not experts, not insiders, but survivors. And now they stood ready to speak, not with titles, but with truth. The ballroom, moments ago alive with applause and curated optimism, had gone still. Lights softened, the music cut, and the stage was reset, visually and emotionally. The screen behind Jasmine no longer displayed graphics or honorees, but a single phrase in stark white lettering: "Voices from the ground." This was no longer a summit of ideas. It had become a courtroom. And Jasmine, standing tall at center stage, became not a keynote speaker, but a vessel through which the public would speak for itself. She turned, nodded once, and three figures emerged from the wings. No handlers, no introductions, just raw presence. These were not influencers, not polished spokespeople. They were the aftermath walking. The first was Michelle Harper, a single mother from East Charlotte, maybe 35, but worn from stress like someone 20 years older. Her hair was tied back, her hands nervously twisting a folder she didn't open. She took the mic with a shaky breath, then steadied. "I lost my job in April of 2020. I applied for emergency housing support 3 times. 3 times, I got silence." Her voice grew firmer. "Meanwhile, I watched a video of my city councilwoman on a damn throne. I couldn't even afford milk." There was no applause, no reaction at all, just the eerie, collective stillness of people processing something too close to home. Behind her came Raymond Ellis, whose veteran's ID had been rejected more times than honored. He walked with a limp, not from pride, but from untreated injuries and months of sleeping in the back of a rusting Ford. His voice was low, but not weak. It carried the calm fury of someone who'd run out of illusions. When the pandemic hit, I waited for help. They said I'd get a housing voucher. I got an eviction notice instead. He swallowed. His hands didn't shake. They clenched. I served this country. I watched brothers die for it. And while I was sleeping in my truck last winter, our community architect was popping champagne with taxpayer money. Somewhere in the back of the room, a woman began to cry quietly. No one turned to look. It wasn't spectacle, it was resonance. Then came Marisol Herrera. The room held its breath before she even spoke. Jasmine had left her for last because hers was the voice that could cut through everything else. She stepped up to the mic still wearing her hospital ID badge. Wrinkled scrubs, tired eyes, but an unwavering spine. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Her voice cracked just once. I worked 14-hour shifts in a COVID ICU with one N95 mask a week. I held the hands of people dying without family. I wrote goodbye letters for them on Post-it notes. She paused. The room ached in silence. Then, and while we begged for gloves and gowns, a party was being planned, with money meant for us. That was the moment something in the room broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. The illusion of leadership had been peeled back. One story at a time? Not with rage, but with truth so undeniable it needed no dressing. Jasmine didn't speak again. She simply stood behind them, eyes locked on the crowd, daring anyone to justify what they'd just heard. These weren't testimonials. They were indictments. The throne may have sat at the center of a birthday party, but its cost was now written in lives, in sleep lost, in dignity stripped. And now everyone knew the price. The stories had landed like strikes, direct, irrefutable, and raw. But power rarely concedes in silence. And as the truth rippled through the room, the queen herself stepped forward, not to confess, but to reclaim control. Tijuana didn't flinch. As the final words of the nurse echoed and died in the room's stunned silence, she rose from her seat like someone summoned by obligation, not guilt. Her movements were fluid, too practiced to be spontaneous. Shoulders squared, expressions serene but calculated, a woman rehearsed in public redemption. She reached for the handheld microphone without a word from the moderator, her polished fingernails clicking softly against the metal as she brought it to her lips. The podium was inches away, but she didn't use it. Instead, she chose open space, optics of vulnerability cloaking the mechanics of control. Her voice cut through the silence with the poise of a press-trained veteran. "Systemic failures are inevitable in a crisis," she said slowly, her tone even and composed. Each word was laid like a brick, measured to construct a wall. "I did everything I could with the tools I was given. Don't blame me for the collapse of a system far bigger than one city or one leader." She spoke like someone holding back tears, though her eyes remained dry and sharp. The cadence of her words hinted at exhaustion, nobility, sacrifice. But the content, the message beneath the rhythm, was one of evasion. Not denial, not outrage, just distance. She looked out over the sea of faces but avoided eye contact with the three who had just stood with their pain laid bare before the nation. They were no longer part of her narrative. She inhaled gently, theatrically, then added, "Leadership doesn't mean being perfect. It means standing firm, even when others try to tear you down." A pause. The silence that followed was not empty. It was evaluating. Then from the far side of the room, a few polite claps emerged. 3, maybe 4. A staffer in a branded lanyard, someone at the end of a media row, another trying too hard to seem neutral, but it didn't catch. The sound fluttered, then fell. No building wave, no echo of agreement. The applause died in midair. What followed was not outrage, but something worse for the powerful: disengagement. Faces turned inward, eyes lowered. Some crossed their arms, others leaned back, processing. The audience hadn't erupted. They'd withdrawn, and in that vacuum, Tijuana stood alone on the stage, her defense echoing against walls that no longer held allegiance. The energy had shifted, not because she had lost control of the room, but because the room had stopped believing it was hers to begin with. The applause had withered. The room had seen through the velvet and veneer. But where Tijuana deflected, Jasmine came to confront. Not with noise, but with proof. And when she stepped forward, the silence welcomed her like a verdict waiting to be read. Jasmine walked onto the stage as if she were stepping into a courtroom, one where the jury was the people and the crime was betrayal. Her steps were slow, not dramatic, but resolute, as if each footfall marked the closing of a distance between silence and justice. She didn't glance at the teleprompter. She didn't acknowledge the cameras or dignitaries. She only looked forward into the crowd of women, veterans, students, and nurses who had sat quietly while truth had knocked, louder and louder, on the gilded door of power. The podium awaited her like a trial bench, and when she arrived, she didn't lean on it. She stood beside it, upright, unguarded, unshaken. Then, with a voice that didn't rise but cut, she began. "Leadership is not about sitting on thrones," she said, pausing just long enough to let the crowd absorb it. "It's about standing among the fallen." The words dropped like stone into still water. The entire room exhaled, but not with relief, with realization. She turned to face the giant LED screen behind her and gestured gently. In an instant, it lit up. No intro slide, no fanfare. Just a cold, gray spreadsheet, evidence, unvarnished and indisputable. Jasmine pointed to the figures with surgical precision, her voice firm and grounded. "This is a bank record. $15,000 withdrawn 3 days before the birthday event. Marked community engagement, event decor." A beat passed. She moved to the next line. "This line, $7,800. Transportation and symbolic imagery. That's the carriage, the white horse." She turned slightly toward the crowd, but her voice stayed steady. "And this one, $9,500. Vendor, Louis Vuitton." There were no gasps, no shocked theatrics, just tightening jaws, furrowed brows, and glances exchanged across rows of seats. The kind of silence that forms not from disbelief, but from confirmation. Then the screen faded. The spreadsheet vanished, and the first video clip rolled. It showed Tijuana Brown in full regalia, emerging from the horse-drawn carriage in slow motion, her gown trailing behind her like royalty, the throne gleaming beneath a golden sunset. The crowd on screen clapped. Cameras flashed. A bottle of champagne exploded nearby. The image was pristine, curated, perfect, but only for a moment. The footage cut harshly, so fast it almost jolted the room, to a new reel. A hospital ward, harsh fluorescent lights, nurses hunched over gurneys, wrapped in plastic, faces obscured by masks that looked weeks old. A ventilator beeped in irregular rhythm, and then a grainy, vertical phone recording. Marisol Herrera pulling off her fogged-up shield, her skin bruised from pressure, whispering, "We're out of gloves again." There was no music, no narration, just contrast, opulence and survival, silk and sweat, champagne and coughs. Then the screen went black. Jasmine stepped forward again, the image of the throne still burned into the background like a stain that refused to be wiped clean. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was not absence. It was the echo of something deeper. Justice finally breathing air in a room that had long suffocated on politics. In that moment, leadership was redefined, and everyone watching knew exactly who had just claimed it. The silence after the final image wasn't empty, it was charged. But in rooms built on image, ego always claws for air. And just as the truth began to settle, Tijuana did what desperate power always does. She interrupted. Tijuana moved like someone who knew she was losing the room and refused to go quietly. She took the microphone without waiting for permission, her posture rigid, lips pressed into a line that trembled at the corners. Her tone came out sharp, slightly elevated, as though volume could drown evidence. But the audience had heard too much, seen too clearly. Still, she pressed on, clinging to the last vestiges of performance. "This is a targeted smear," she declared, forcing a half smile that no longer reached her eyes. My birthday was a moment of uplift after a year of grief. The throne was a symbol. I didn't take anything I didn't deserve. The words floated, unmoored, reaching out for sympathy that never came. She tried to soften her gaze, tried to lean into vulnerability, but it was too practiced, too late. She stepped toward the edge of the stage, as if narrowing the physical distance might restore the emotional trust she had just seen collapse. Her hands spread open in that familiar gesture. "Look at me, I'm being honest." But her voice betrayed the tightening behind her polished facade. "We all coped in our own ways. I gave hope to my community, and now I'm being dragged for it." This time, the room didn't even murmur. The space around her felt colder, denser, and though she stood beneath the lights, she looked smaller than she had minutes ago. Not humbled, but exposed. She had underestimated the power of first-hand testimony, of receipts, of contradiction made visible. She had overplayed her myth in a moment that demanded truth. Then Jasmine stepped forward again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. She simply stood there with a stillness that demanded attention and said the one thing that no defense could withstand. "How many thrones can replace an ICU bed?" she asked, her voice calm but sharpened by a truth no applause could drown. "You didn't take money. You took someone's chance to live." The weight of it hit like a dropped hammer. Fast, clean, absolute. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a verdict. Tijuana froze, shoulders stiffening as if bracing for impact. But it had already landed. Around the room, motion returned in subtle, devastating ways. Hands reached to lapels. Pins bearing Honoree Tijuana Brown were unclipped slowly, deliberately, with the kind of solemnity reserved for funerals and final judgments. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The act itself spoke volumes. "We see now, and we won't carry your name anymore." The soft clinks of metal against tablecloths were the only sound, but in that silence, reputations collapsed. The throne hadn't shattered. It had been disassembled, one pin at a time. The silence after Jasmine's final words didn't just end the debate, it detonated the illusion. But while the ballroom held its breath, behind the curtains, power scrambled to survive, and justice, quiet, patient, was already waiting in the lobby. Behind the stage, chaos moved in hushed tones. Organizers huddled in tight circles, heads bent, phones pressed to ears, voices clipped and strained. The summit director, once glowing in a custom burgundy suit, now paced back and forth with a clipboard clutched like a shield. Words like damage control, optics, and breach of trust were whispered like code in a war room. Aides darted in and out of the service hallway with flushed faces and trembling hands. No one dared make eye contact with the media. The room that had once buzzed with ambition now pulsed with something far more primal: fear. Jasmine hadn't just disrupted a keynote, she had shattered a narrative, and the cracks were widening by the minute. On the upper level, the VIP sponsor suite emptied like a sinking ship. Representatives from two major nonprofit coalitions walked out without a word, leaving behind untouched appetizers and open folders of pre-signed MOU agreements. The head of a West Coast grant consortium instructed her assistant flatly, "We're pulling funding." Now, a lobbyist for a healthcare company folded his press badge in half and dropped it into a trash bin on the way out. The cascade had begun, not loud, but final. Within an hour, 4 scheduled breakout sessions were quietly canceled. By the second hour, every poster of Tijuana Brown had been taken down or quietly covered by navy curtains. The brand had become a liability, but the real reckoning didn't come from sponsors or silence. It came in black suits and federal badges. At 3:42 p.m., 2 dark sedans pulled up to the curb outside the hotel's east entrance. No sirens, no flashing lights, just methodical steps. Guests milling in the lobby paused only for a moment before stepping back. Something about the way the men moved, the way they carried black leather folios and wore mirrored IDs, triggered instinct. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel-gray eyes and a no-nonsense gait, walked directly to the concierge and presented a sealed warrant. Her voice was low, professional, and immovable. "We're here to execute a federal summons. We need access to conference registration records and suite key logs immediately. The concierge blinked twice before nodding. No questions asked. Somewhere upstairs, Tijuana was still in her dressing room, trying to call her PR team. Her phone had begun ringing nonstop with blocked numbers and unfamiliar area codes. A message from a longtime donor flashed across her screen. "We're out. Do not contact us." But she didn't see it. Her hands trembled too hard to unlock the screen. Downstairs, a junior volunteer handed the agents a printed floor plan, unaware of what he had just ignited. The agents thanked him, then moved fast. Professional, silent, surgical. They didn't need to ask where the problem was. The truth had already drawn a map. The file Jasmine had submitted a week ago, a full dossier with financial records, sworn witness statements, and encrypted copies of shell company registries, had made its way up the chain fast. Faster than anyone expected. Faster than Tijuana ever dreamed it could. One floor above the ballroom, the agents split. Two headed to the administrative suite, the others to the service elevator. Hotel staff didn't resist. The agents moved with a calm that only years of prosecution and disappointment can instill. The kind of calm that said, "We've seen this before, and we already know how it ends." Backstage, a production assistant dropped her headset when the elevator doors opened, and the agent stepped into view. The moderator from the last panel looked up mid-sentence, mouth frozen in the shape of a smile meant for Instagram. But this wasn't that kind of moment. The lead agent gave a single nod, pulled out a copy of the warrant, and said clearly, "We're looking for Councilwoman Brown." "Where is she?" No one answered at first, not because they didn't know, but because they finally understood what the answer meant. Inside her suite, Tijuana sat hunched at the edge of a designer love seat, heels kicked off, hair half undone, staring at the last open tab on her tablet screen. A news headline: "Brown accused of diverting COVID relief funds. Evidence presented during live conference." The door knocked once, twice. Then came the voice. "Councilwoman Brown? Federal agents, please open the door." She didn't move. Downstairs, Jasmine stood quietly near the exit. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smiling. She had no press around her, no camera lights on, just a folder under her arm, and a look that wasn't vindication, but responsibility. She had done what needed to be done, not to destroy, but to reveal. Because when justice moves, it doesn't always scream. Sometimes it walks, calm, certain, wearing a badge, and it arrives exactly when it's meant to. The agents had the door. The warrant was active. The illusion was gone. And when the elevator doors finally opened, there was no ceremony, just reckoning dressed in federal blue. The elevator doors opened with a hiss that seemed almost ceremonial, though what stepped out was not royalty, but the ruin of one. Tijuana Brown stood between two federal agents, her posture rigid, her chin slightly lifted as if trying to hold on to some last thread of dignity. Her hands were free, but she moved as though she were shackled by something heavier than cuffs. Reputation, exposure, consequence. Her blazer, perfectly tailored just hours ago, now seemed too tight, as though the truth itself was constricting around her. She didn't speak. She didn't resist. She just walked forward, escorted by agents whose faces gave away nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. This wasn't their story. They were just the exclamation point at the end of Jasmine's sentence. The hotel lobby, once a place of opulent calm and polite networking, had become a crucible of judgment. The soft music had been cut. The reception desk, once a place for spa bookings and luggage tags, now leaned under the weight of cameras, reporters, and boom mics angled with surgical precision. Phones were raised by the dozen. Streams went live. Headlines formed in real time. Councilwoman Brown escorted by FBI. COVID fund scandal, arrest on scene. Every step she took was recorded, archived, dissected. But no one called her name now. Not as a leader, not as an honoree, not even as a person. The crowd parted, not out of respect, but instinct. No one wanted to stand too close to the fall. She looked around, eyes scanning the lobby she once glided through with ease. It didn't look the same anymore. The lights felt harsher. The space felt smaller. Every face she met was unreadable or turned away. Some took photos, some just watched, but none looked at her the way they used to. The illusion of power, once wrapped in speeches and silk, had vanished in the time it took for a single spreadsheet to hit the screen. Then came the voice. It didn't come from a journalist or a protester. It came from the crowd, from someone without a microphone or platform, but with something infinitely more powerful. Loss. Thanks for everything, the man said, voice raw, rising above the silence like a final verdict. But now give back what belongs to the dead. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't rehearsed. It was truth, delivered in the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose. The man held up a photograph, an 18-year-old girl in medical scrubs, eyes bright, smile full, his daughter. She had died during the height of the pandemic, on a waiting list, in a system overrun, while money meant for relief went to fund velvet ropes and champagne toasts. The lobby stopped. Even the cameras paused, lens shutters suddenly feeling intrusive. The agent slowed. Tijuana turned slightly, just enough to see him, just enough to recognize that face, that grief, that final cost. Her eyes didn't widen, her lips didn't move, but her shoulders sank ever so slightly, as if the weight of what she had done finally found its way through the layers of denial. She said nothing, because what could she say? The man lowered the photo, but his gaze never left her. His words hung in the air, heavier than any charge, louder than any press headline. There would be indictments, there would be hearings. But this was the moment of reckoning no judge could replicate. This was justice that didn't need a courtroom. The agents resumed walking. She followed. Outside, a black SUV waited at the curb. Its windows were dark. Its door was open. Not for honor, not for ceremony, for consequence. Behind her, something dropped. A commemorative pin, once worn by a delegate proudly displaying her allegiance. Tijuana Brown, legacy leader. It hit the marble floor with a small metallic click. One bounce, then silence. No one picked it up. No one needed to. The story had moved on, and this time, there would be no throne waiting at the end. As the SUV disappeared into the distance and the last shutter clicked shut, the ballroom was still reeling from the fallout. But amid the debris of image and illusion, the organizers turned, not to salvage reputation, but to reclaim purpose. And in that moment, there was only one voice the room trusted to end what had begun in silence. Jasmine's. There was no ceremony to the invitation, just a silent gesture, a microphone extended like an olive branch, like an admission that the event needed saving, and there was only one person left with enough truth to do it. Jasmine took it not with pride, but with resolve. She didn't ask what the audience expected. She didn't check a watch, a prompt, or a teleprompter. She didn't need to. She had lived the moment, every thread of it, and now she would speak it into the air, unfiltered. The air in the ballroom was thick, almost soupy, as if the weight of everything that had unfolded had raised the temperature, the pressure, the stakes. Delegates sat in unmoving rows, the banners still draped behind them, now resembling more of a memorial than a celebration. The stage lights dimmed slightly as she stepped forward. No music, no applause, just a growing magnetic silence. Her voice rose, not with force, but with clarity. Each syllable felt personal, aimed not at the crowd but into it, as though she were threading through armor to reach something deeper. "I didn't come here to take anyone's throne," she began. "I came here to ask, in the race for power, who did we leave behind?" That question didn't need repeating. It echoed on its own, carving its way into the corners of the ballroom. It was the kind of question that had no easy answer, only the reflection it forced onto those brave enough to let it land. Jasmine stood tall, eyes sweeping across the sea of faces, executives in suits, activists with lanyards still looped tightly around their necks, young organizers frozen in wide-eyed stillness. She didn't move her hands, she didn't pace. The stillness was deliberate, measured, like a judge who already knew the verdict, but needed the court to feel it for themselves. She let the silence breathe, then broke it, not with policy, not with rhetoric, but with story. "I met a man in Charlotte 2 months ago," she said. "His name was Aaron. He worked nights at a packing warehouse. His wife, Maria, had asthma and diabetes, pre-existing conditions that made COVID more than a threat. It made it a countdown. She exhaled slowly, not for effect, but to hold back the tremor at the edge of truth. When Maria fell ill, he drove her to the emergency room himself. She couldn't breathe. He asked for an oxygen tank. They told him they were out. He called the city hotline 6 times. 6. Each time a different excuse. Shortage, delay, paperwork. On the 7th, they told him the inventory had been rerouted to another district for a political photo op. The room began to shift, not in movement, but in mood. Faces dropped. Some eyes watered. Jasmine's voice remained steady, not dramatic, not angry, just real. He sat by her side that night, holding her hand, listening to her breaths slow, knowing each one could be her last. She looked at him and whispered, "I'm scared." And he couldn't do anything. No ventilator, no tank. No one answered his final call. She paused again, let the words settle like dust after an explosion. No one moved. No one dared to. He buried her 3 days later, in a cardboard coffin, in a parking lot behind a church. He told me it wasn't the virus that killed her. It was being told by a system that she wasn't important enough to save. Jasmine looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces, suddenly small. While that man was begging for a tank of oxygen, we were debating what brand of champagne to serve at a leadership gala. While his wife was dying, someone was custom ordering a throne. The weight in the room changed. It became personal, collective, inescapable. This was no longer a story about her or them. It was a mirror. "I'm not here to shame you," she said, her voice lowering. "I'm not here to lecture you or to take a title or to build one for myself. I'm here because someone has to remember what we promised. We told people they mattered. We held press conferences and town halls and hashtag campaigns and said, 'We will not forget you.' But we did. We forgot them the second the cameras turned off." A woman near the front stifled a sob. An older man in the second row quietly removed his name tag and folded it into his palm. "I'm asking you to think. How many names do we not know? How many faces were blurred behind statistics and excuses and party invitations?" She took one step forward. No music rose, no crescendo. Just one last truth that didn't need volume, only conviction. "Honor isn't given in medals," Jasmine said, her voice now barely above a whisper, but heard by every heart in the room. "It's shown in how you act when no one's looking." That was it. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't nod. She handed back the mic and walked away from the stage, not toward the media pit, not toward the organizers, but through the crowd, past stunned faces, lowered heads, glistening eyes. Each step left behind not power, but accountability. Behind her, the silence remained, not empty, not defeated, just different. A silence now carrying something it hadn't before: truth. Jasmine had left the stage without applause, without victory, but with something far more enduring: clarity. And in the silence that followed, something powerful began to rise. Not from the podium, but from the people. It started not with a cheer, not with a call to action, but with the unmistakable scrape of a single chair against polished ballroom tile. A young man, maybe 20, maybe younger, stood slowly, shoulders square, eyes fixed not on Jasmine, but on the space she had just occupied. He didn't speak. He simply raised his right hand, palm forward, not clenched like a fist, not curled in salute, but open, vulnerable, steady. For a breathless second, he stood alone. Then 2 rows back, a girl in a denim jacket rose to her feet beside him, another beside her, then a line of students in university polos, then 4, then 6, until the sound of fabric brushing against chairs became a rhythm of resistance. 100, then 2. Then nearly every young person in the room was on their feet, a silent rising, not for applause but for accountability. No one had planned it. There was no hashtag, no campaign. This was not performance. It was instinct. Something had cracked open in that ballroom, not just the illusion of leadership, but the fear that had kept so many silent for so long. They stood not in protest, but in presence. Not in allegiance to Jasmine, but in allegiance to the very idea she had spoken aloud. The truth must outlive convenience. Their raised hands weren't pledges of loyalty. They were shields, promises, testaments to a simple belief that even when the world turns away, someone must still speak. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Their bodies spoke for them. On the edges of the room, older delegates and staffers watched in stillness, some with awe, some with guilt. One woman, graying at the temples, her credentials from 5 past conferences around her neck like medals, sank slowly back into her seat, tears rolling down her cheeks. She had written part of the opening script, helped vet the nominees, sat on the panel that approved Tijuana's award, and now, watching these students rise, she whispered to no one in particular, "They're better than we were." Meanwhile, Jasmine hadn't stopped walking. Her heels clicked softly against the ballroom floor as she moved down the center aisle, not on the elevated runner reserved for honorees, but on the narrow strip between folding chairs where volunteers and scholarship recipients sat. People tried to get her attention, organizers with worried eyes, aides motioning toward the VIP corridor, security suggesting a press holding room. But she moved past all of them, not out of defiance, but out of deliberate choice. Jasmine had spoken her truth on the stage. She was here now to walk through it. As she passed, students stepped aside not out of reverence, but to make space for her to keep going. No one reached for a selfie. No one stopped her for sound bites. They just watched, as one woman walked like a witness through the echo of a lie that had finally collapsed. And then she saw her, a girl no older than 10, standing just beside the aisle, her feet not even fully planted in her shoes. She wore a simple white dress and oversized glasses. Her curls were tied back by a frayed pink ribbon. On her chest was a badge, Youth Guest, Speaker's Daughter. Jasmine slowed, stopped. The girl stared at her, unblinking, clutching a small notebook against her ribs as if it held something sacred. Jasmine knelt, lowering herself to eye level, brushing aside the noise, the moment, the weight of the entire day, and looked at her like she was the only person in the world. She didn't ask the girl's name. She didn't need to. She took her hand, small and shaking, and held it gently between both of hers. The girl opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Only a small gasp, a breath caught between awe and emotion. Then Jasmine leaned in, her voice quiet but unwavering. "The throne doesn't make you stand taller," she said. "But if you stand tall for truth, no throne in the world can make you fall." The words were not meant for the crowd. They were not part of a speech. They were for her, and every girl like her who had ever been told to wait, to behave, to shrink. And though the girl said nothing in return, she nodded, once, slowly, and held Jasmine's hand just a little tighter. Behind them, the students still stood. Their arms had not fallen. They weren't just participating. They were becoming something new, something necessary. Leaders who wouldn't wait for titles. Protectors who didn't need power to speak. Jasmine turned and looked at them one last time. Not to wave, not to bask, but to see, to witness the change already taking shape. There was no music, there was no standing ovation, but there was movement, a shift, and it would last far longer than any speech, any scandal, any throne. Because in that moment, the baton didn't need to be passed. It had already been picked up. The room hadn't applauded, but it had awakened. Jasmine had stepped out through the side exit, but her final words lingered like thunder after lightning. Quiet now, but unforgotten. And in the aftermath, as the dust settled and the illusions crumbled, one truth stood taller than any stage. Some stories don't end with punishment. They begin with perspective. What remained was not silence. It was reckoning, a slow, pulsing truth that settled deep in the bones of everyone who had witnessed it. There were no balloons, no signature boards, no post-event cocktail hour. People didn't speak because they couldn't, not yet. What they had witnessed wasn't just a scandal. It was a confrontation with a question most had spent their lives avoiding. Who do we become when no one's watching? Tijuana Brown had not fallen because of malice. She had fallen because of comfort. Because at some point, the line between leadership and entitlement had blurred, and no one had been brave enough to call it out until Jasmine did. But this wasn't just about a woman who misused funds. It was about every system that had enabled her, every voice that had stayed quiet, every dollar that had been spent in polished rooms while people outside those rooms were left gasping for air. The lesson didn't come wrapped in applause. It came in silence. It came in the girl Jasmine knelt beside, in the hundreds of students who stood not to celebrate, but to promise. It came in the faces of those who sat at round tables, wondering when exactly they stopped listening and started managing. Jasmine hadn't brought down an empire. She had simply turned on the lights, and in doing so, revealed just how many shadows were hiding behind good intentions. Because the real danger in power isn't greed, it's forgetting who it was meant to serve. This story wasn't about a throne, or a birthday party, or even a stolen dollar figure. It was about the oxygen tank that never arrived, the eviction notice taped to the door of a veteran's home, the nurse who wore the same mask for 7 days straight. Those people weren't anecdotes, they were casualties of comfort. The kind of comfort that lets leaders justify luxury, while others suffocate in policy gaps and unreturned phone calls. Jasmine didn't ask to be the one to say it out loud, but once she saw it, she knew she couldn't stay quiet. And that is what made her dangerous. Not because she shouted, but because she saw, because she refused to unsee. The human lesson was not in the fall, it was in the rise. Not the rise of Jasmine, but of those who stood after her, of the students who didn't wait for hashtags or headlines to speak, of the organizers who now reviewed every budget line with new eyes, of the donors who realized that photo ops and plated dinners were not the measure of change. It was never about being right. It was about being responsible. Jasmine didn't walk out of that ballroom with a trophy. She walked out carrying something heavier, the knowledge that truth, once spoken, demands action. And if that action doesn't follow, then the truth becomes a weapon turned inward. But the greatest human lesson came in that single sentence she left behind, the one the little girl would remember long after the lights were off and the stage was cleared. The throne doesn't make you stand taller, but if you stand tall for truth, no throne in the world can make you fall. That wasn't inspiration. That was instruction, a challenge. A torch passed not with ceremony, but with courage. Because in the end, justice is not the arrest. It's the awakening. Justice is not just consequences. It's correction. It's the hard, grinding, unglamorous work of looking at your own hands and asking, what have I protected? Who have I ignored? And what am I willing to do differently now? The real villains in stories like these are not the ones who get caught. It's the silence that allowed them to thrive. The culture that treated accountability as betrayal. The rooms that clapped before asking who was missing from the table. Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose one woman, she exposed a mirror. And every person in that room had to decide whether to look into it or look away. So the lesson is simple, but it's not easy. It's not glamorous. It doesn't trend. It doesn't end in applause. The lesson is this: power without empathy is a crown of ash. Truth without courage is just silence with better lighting. And leadership without accountability is not leadership at all. That is the cost of forgetting. That is the price of pretending. And that is the burden every room must now carry. Until someone like Jasmine is no longer the exception, but the expectation. Truth had been spoken, the mirror had shattered, and the silence was no longer neutral. But clarity without action is just another broken promise. And Jasmine's story didn't end with truth. It demanded a response. So now what? Do we mourn, mutter, and move on? Do we file the footage away under moments that made us think and scroll to the next headline? No, not this time. Not after the throne cracked beneath the weight of truth. Not after the father held up his daughter's photograph with a voice heavier than any judge's gavel. Not after students stood, hands raised in quiet rebellion, not to Jasmine but to justice. What you witnessed was not the end of a scandal. It was the beginning of a standard. One that says we no longer clap for symbols while people suffocate in silence. One that says we will not let comfort mask corruption, not in our cities, not in our schools, not in our government, and not in ourselves. This is your moment, not Jasmine's, yours. Because real leadership doesn't live on stages. It starts in small, shaking choices made in rooms where no cameras roll. It starts when you raise your hand in a meeting and ask why funds were diverted. It starts when you show up to a budget hearing and stay even when you're not on the agenda. It starts when you ask your mayor where the COVID money went. It starts when you look at that polished press release and say, I want the receipts. Because democracy without demand is decoration, and people are dying under decorations. Jasmine didn't burn down the building. She just turned on the lights. Now the rest is up to us. And if you think you're too small, too unknown, too unimportant, remember who sat on that stage. Jasmine didn't come from money. She didn't come with armies. She came with documents, with voices, with scars. She came because someone had to, because no one else would. And that right there is the difference. The ones who act not because they're powerful, but because they're needed. So stop waiting. Stop waiting for permission to be outraged. Stop waiting for the right credentials to speak. Stop waiting for someone in a better suit to care more than you do. Do not confuse credentials with character. Do not confuse titles with truth. Be the one who walks into the next town hall and asks the question no one else will. Be the one who pulls public records, not out of suspicion, but out of civic duty. Be the one who tells your children that standing up is more valuable than fitting in. And when they ask you why it matters, tell them this story. Tell them about the woman who didn't run for a throne, but ran toward the fire. Tell them about the nurse who wore one mask for 7 days while luxury bags were handed out as party favors. Tell them about the girl in the white dress, wide-eyed and silent, and how Jasmine didn't give her power. She showed her she already had it. And don't stop there. Build networks, form alliances, become ungovernable to injustice. Learn how the money moves in your town. Learn the names behind the titles. Learn where the pressure points are and never stop pressing. Show up so often they dread seeing your face, not because you're rude, but because you know too much. Know what they want you to forget. Learn what they hope you'll never ask. Make it impossible for anyone to sit on another throne built on borrowed suffering, because the greatest lie power tells is that it can't be reached. Jasmine reached it, and so can you. Do it loudly. Do it with facts. Do it with kindness sharpened like a blade. Do it in meetings. Do it in classrooms. Do it in libraries and courtrooms and voting booths and school board elections. Do it in group chats. Do it on live streams. Do it on sidewalks. Do it with your friends. Do it when it's awkward. Do it when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Because here's the secret Jasmine revealed, the one too many forget. Power is never taken all at once. It's eroded by every small truth that refuses to shut up. So let this be the day you remember not just what she said, but what it sparked. Let this be the day you look around and say, not on my watch. Let this be the day you understand that the most revolutionary thing you can do is not forget. And when they ask where you were when the room went quiet, you say, I stood, I spoke, I didn't wait. Now it's your turn. Go. You've heard the call. You've felt the tremor. But conviction without continuity is a fire without fuel. What matters now is not the echo of what Jasmine said. It's what you do with the silence that follows. So ask yourself this. What are you willing to risk for what you know is right? Because the truth is, doing the right thing isn't safe. It's not clean. It doesn't come with applause or guaranteed protection. It comes with side eyes in staff meetings, with funding mysteriously drying up, with emails that stop getting answered, with being called difficult, divisive, or unprofessional in rooms where you were once praised for being a team player. But here's the thing Jasmine knew, the thing you must now hold tightly. They don't call you difficult until you start making a difference. And when they do, that's when you push harder. This fight is not hypothetical. It's in your city budget. It's in the housing board meeting on Thursday night. It's in the contract renewal no one read. It's in the procurement order with no transparency. It's in the side deal cut behind the press release. And it's waiting for someone, not someone perfect, not someone powerful, just someone present enough to say, wait a minute. Someone to ask who benefits from this. Someone to ask who gets left behind. Jasmine's courage wasn't rare because she was a genius. It was rare because she stayed in the room when things got uncomfortable and refused to let comfort rewrite reality. You don't need a stage to do that. You don't need a title. You need only one thing: the refusal to look away, to keep asking questions even when they roll their eyes, to name names even when they whisper back, to raise your voice even when others lower theirs. Because the system doesn't break under pressure, it bends under persistence. And truth told once may shake the walls, but truth told every day brings them down. So hold the line. If your school district misuses funds, show up at the board meeting with a copy of the expenditure report. If your representative disappears until election season, show up at their office and then bring 10 more people. If your neighborhood is forgotten in disaster funding, start knocking on doors. Don't do it for clout. Don't do it for Twitter likes. Do it because someone has to. Do it because Jasmine did, and because now that you've seen the playbook, you have no excuse not to use it. Build coalitions, not just with people who agree with you, but with those who feel forgotten too. The mother who works 3 jobs and doesn't know her councilman's name. The janitor who voted once and never again because nothing changed. The student who thinks policy is a distant planet. Reach them, talk to them, empower them, not by telling them what you know, but by reminding them what they've always known but were told didn't matter. That's the real revolution. Not more noise, but more voices. Not more heroes, but more hands. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.